The Salem Witch Trials. These three words conjure up a truly chilling chapter in American history. It was a time when fear gripped a small community in colonial Massachusetts. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Innocent people were accused of impossible crimes, of being witches in league with the devil. These trials didn't happen in some far-off medieval land, but in America as it was just beginning. They stand as a stark warning, a reminder of how things can go terribly wrong. We remember them because they show us the dark side of belief, fear, and the terrible consequences of injustice. It is a story that still haunts the American imagination, a dark stain on its early years. So when and where did this dark drama unfold? We need to travel back in time to the very end of the 17th century. The years were 1692 and 1693. The place was a small, rather isolated settlement called Salem Village. This was part of the much larger Massachusetts Bay Colony, one of the early English settlements in North America. Life here was hard. The people were Puritans, deeply religious folk who had crossed the vast Atlantic Ocean seeking religious freedom. They lived by strict rules, and their world was one of constant toil, prayer, and a watchful eye for sin and the devil's influence in their daily lives. To understand Salem, we must understand the Puritan mind. These were people who believed with absolute certainty in God, but they also believed just as strongly in the devil. For them, the devil wasn't just an idea. He was a real powerful being. He was constantly trying to tempt people away from God and lead them into sin. And witches? Well, witches were his servants on earth. They were individuals who had supposedly made a pact with Satan, gaining dark powers in return for their souls. This belief wasn't unique to Salem. It was common across Europe and the American colonies at the time. On top of this fervent religious belief, Salem Village was a troubled place. There were many simmering tensions just below the surface. Arguments over land and property were common. Different factions within the village church often squabbled. The recent and brutal King William's War with Native American tribes, supported by the French, had left people feeling anxious and insecure. Refugees from the war had even come to Salem, adding to the strain. This atmosphere of fear, suspicion, and division created a fertile ground. It was a place where the seeds of hysteria, once planted, could grow very quickly indeed. People were looking for explanations for their troubles, and the devil seemed a likely culprit. The trouble began in a most unsettling way, in the home of Salem Village's minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. Early in 1692, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty Parris, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, started acting very strangely. They would scream, make odd noises, and contort their bodies into unnatural positions. They complained of being pinched and pricked by invisible forces. Other young women in the village soon began to show similar symptoms. Doctors were called, but they were baffled. They could find no natural cause for these alarming fits. It was a mystery that deeply worried the small, God-fearing community. With no medical explanation, the community turned to another possibility: witchcraft. It seemed to fit the terrifying symptoms described by the afflicted girls. The local minister, Reverend Parris, and other concerned adults began to pressure Betty, Abigail, and the other afflicted girls. They asked them who was causing their suffering, who was bewitching them. Under such intense questioning, the girls started to name names. A key idea here was spectral evidence. This meant that if an afflicted person claimed to see the spirit or spectre of someone tormenting them, that was considered evidence that the accused person was indeed a witch, even if no one else saw the spirit. The very first people accused were not powerful or well-respected members of the community. Instead, they were women on the fringes of Salem society. There was Tituba, an enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, originally from the Caribbean. There was Sarah Good, a homeless beggar known for muttering to herself. And there was Sarah Osborne, an elderly, impoverished woman who had been involved in disputes over her late husband's estate and rarely attended church. These women were easy targets. They were different, vulnerable, and already viewed with some suspicion by their more conformist neighbors. They lacked the social standing or allies to effectively defend themselves against such terrifying accusations. The situation escalated dramatically when Tituba, after days of relentless questioning and likely under duress, confessed. She didn't just confess to being a witch. She spun vivid, frightening tales. She spoke of signing the devil's book, of flying on a broomstick, of seeing other witches and strange animals. the devil's familiars. Her confession was like throwing fuel on a fire. It seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. Witches were real, they were active in Salem, and they were trying to destroy the community. Tituba also named other women as witches, and so the circle of accusations began to widen, spreading like a contagion through the anxious village. With accusations mounting, the colonial authorities had to act. In May 1692, the newly appointed governor of Massachusetts, Sir William Phips, established a special court to hear the witchcraft cases. It was called the Court of Oya and Termina, which means to hear and to determine. This court was set up quickly, perhaps too quickly. It lacked many of the legal safeguards that we would expect today. For example, the accused were not always allowed legal representation. The judges, including men like William Stoughton, were firm believers in witchcraft and seemed predisposed to find the accused guilty. The very process was weighted heavily against those who stood accused. For those accused, life became a nightmare. Once a formal complaint was made, the accused person would be arrested. They were often shackled and imprisoned in dreadful conditions. Jails in the 17th century were cold, dark and dirty places, often overcrowded. Prisoners had to pay for their own food and upkeep, meaning poorer individuals suffered even more. The accused were repeatedly interrogated and urged to confess. A confession could save your life, as the Puritans believed God would not punish a penitent soul. However, a confession often meant you had to name other witches, thus perpetuating the cycle of accusations and fear. Denying the charges, on the other hand, usually meant you would face trial. The trials themselves were extraordinary and terrifying spectacles. The afflicted girls were often present in the courtroom. When an accused person entered or spoke, the girls would writhe, scream, and claim to be tormented by the accused's spectre. This dramatic and likely often feigned suffering was taken as powerful evidence of guilt. The accused had very little opportunity to present a proper defense. Witnesses who spoke in their favor might even find themselves accused of witchcraft too. Spectral evidence, as mentioned before, was a crucial part of the prosecution's case, despite its obviously unverifiable nature. The burden of proof was effectively reversed. The accused had to prove they were innocent, an almost impossible task. The outcomes were tragic and swift. Bridget Bishop, a woman known for her somewhat flamboyant dress and independent spirit, was the first person to be tried by the new court. She was found guilty and hanged on June 10, 1692, on Gallows Hill in Salem town. Over the following months, the trials continued and more people were condemned. In total, 19 men and women were hanged as witches. One elderly man, Giles Corey, refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. As a result, he was subjected to a horrifying form of torture called pressing, where heavy stones were piled on his chest until he died. Several other accused individuals died in prison due to the harsh conditions. As the summer of 1692 turned into autumn, something began to shift. The accusations had started to spread beyond the initial outcasts. Respected members of the community, wealthy individuals, and even ministers and their wives were being named as witches. One of the most notable was the accusation against Lady Mary Phips, the wife of Governor William Phips himself. This overreach began to make some influential people uneasy. They started to question the reliability of the accusers, particularly the young women whose dramatic testimonies had been so central. Could they really be trusted? Were their visions truly from God, or perhaps from the devil himself, designed to sow chaos? More voices of caution began to be heard. Prominent ministers, such as Increase Mather, a respected Puritan leader and the father of Cotton Mather, who had initially supported the trials, started to speak out. Increase Mather published a work titled Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, arguing that spectral evidence was unreliable and should not be used to convict someone of witchcraft. He famously stated, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." Influenced by these arguments and likely concerned by the accusation against his own wife, Governor Phips took decisive action in October 1692. He ordered a halt to the arrests and disbanded the Court of Oya and Termina. The end of the Court of Oya and Termina marked the beginning of the end for the trials. Governor Phips established a new Superior Court of Judicature in January 1693 to handle the remaining cases. This new court was instructed not to allow spectral evidence. Without this key proof, most of the remaining trials resulted in acquittals. By May 1693, Governor Phipps had pardoned and released all those still imprisoned on witchcraft charges. The terrible fever had finally broken. In the years that followed, there were public apologies and some attempts at financial restitution for the victims and their families. For example, in 1711, the Massachusetts government formally apologized and offered compensation, though not all families accepted it, and the amounts were often small. The Salem Witch Trials remain a profoundly sobering episode in American history. What can we learn from this dark time? They teach us about the terrifying dangers of mass hysteria when fear and suspicion can overwhelm reason and justice. They highlight the critical importance of due process in law, the right to a fair trial, to legal representation, and to be considered innocent until proven guilty. The trials also remind us of the need to question authority and to protect minorities and those on the fringes of society who can easily become scapegoats. They show how easily fear can be manipulated, leading to the persecution of innocent people. The Shadow of Salem warns us to always be vigilant against witch hunts in any form, whenever and wherever they may appear.